You know, for decades, there's been this one question that's haunted the halls of power, a real what if that keeps strategists up at night. What if diplomacy with North Korea just fails for good? What happens next? Well, we're about to step into a possible future to explore exactly that. We're going to see how a war could unfold and, maybe more importantly, what that chaotic aftermath would mean for Korea and for all of us. To really get what's at stake here, let's do something a little different. We're going to start at the end, in the year 2030. This quote is from Lee Hae-won. She grew up under the Kim regime, and now she's free. But that freedom was paid for with her father's life. Her words, they really captured the heartbreaking paradox at the center of this whole story. And that right there, that's the huge mystery we're unpacking today. The invasion, by all military metrics, was a success. The tyrant is gone, the nuclear threat is dealt with. But how in the world did that clear-cut win unleash this entirely new kind of chaos? How did it create problems that were maybe even worse than the one it solved? To find the answer, we have to rewind the clock. All right, so let's set the scene. We're jumping back to the summer of 2023. Think of it like a powder keg that's been sitting there for years. Tensions were already sky high, but then Pyongyang starts making moves so aggressive, so reckless, that every single diplomatic off-ramp just closes. This was the world getting pushed past the point of no return. And what's just wild is how fast this all happens. This isn't a slow crawl to war, it's a 15-day freefall. First, boom, a nuclear test 10 times bigger than Hiroshima. Just a few days later, they shoot down a US plane, killing 24 Americans. And the final straw? They threaten an EMP blast over the Pacific, a weapon that could literally knock a country back into the Dark Ages. For Washington, the time for talking was just over. So the response is swift. The US and its allies launch Operation Peninsula Shield. And from a purely military textbook standpoint, it was a masterclass. But, and this is a huge but, that victory came at a staggering price right from the very first hour. 25 days. Just let that sink in for a second. A dynasty that had terrorized its people and threatened the world for 3 generations was gone in less than a month. On paper, it looks like one of the most decisive victories in modern history. The reality on the ground, though, well, that was a horror story told in numbers. And this chart, wow, this really lays out that brutal truth. Look at this. Over the entire 25-day campaign, the coalition lost 8,600 soldiers, a terrible, heavy cost. But in the first 24 hours, North Korea's dying regime just rained artillery down on Seoul, killing almost double that number, 15,000 civilians. The war was won, but it began with an unimaginable slaughter of the very people it was supposed to save. And if you thought that was bad, then came the real post-war nightmare. The war's over, so the good guys go in to round up all the nukes. Simple, right? Nope. They expected to find, say, 30 or 40 bombs. They only found 22. So, where are the others? Hidden? Smuggled out during the chaos? Sold? You see the problem here. In getting rid of one massive nuclear threat, the war may have accidentally created a dozen smaller, untraceable ones. So, the shooting stops. The victory is declared. But as all that smoke clears, everyone starts to realize something pretty terrifying. The first war might be over, but the real war, the war for the soul of Korea, was just getting started. And this next fight wasn't going to be won with jets and tanks. I mean, just look at this comparison. It is almost impossible to wrap your head around the challenge. This wasn't just about one side having money and the other not. It was a reality gap. It's like they were from different planets. You have one of the most advanced societies on Earth, and you're fusing it with a place where millions of people literally believed their dead leader performed miracles. How do you even begin to build one nation out of that? To put this in perspective, just think about Germany. When East and West Germany reunited, it cost the equivalent of $2 trillion. And let's be crystal clear, East Germany was in way, way better shape than North Korea ever was. The final bill for this was going to be absolutely astronomical, and guess who was on the hook for pretty much all of it? South Korea. And boy, did that bill come due fast. Fast forward just 3 years to 2026. That beautiful, patriotic dream of one Korea, it's starting to feel like a nightmare. People are getting crushed by taxes, there's social friction everywhere. They called it integration fatigue, and it led to this shocking number. Nearly 4 out of 10 South Koreans felt that reunification, their national dream for 70 years, had been a catastrophic mistake. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. because this wasn't just about Korea. The fallout from this war, it sent shockwaves across the entire globe. It completely redrew the map in Asia, shaking up old friendships and creating brand new rivalries. And here's where things get really ironic. Who came out on top of all this? You could make a strong case that it was China. Think about it. They sat on the sidelines while the US spent blood and treasure. Then, when the dust settled, China just swoops in. They start funding the rebuilding, they lock down economic deals, and suddenly everyone, Seoul, Washington, needs them. They lost a chaotic ally, sure, but they gained a ton of leverage. Meanwhile, over in Japan, this war caused an absolute political earthquake. They looked at this new, messy region, saw China getting stronger, and basically said, okay, game on. They threw off the last shackles of their post-World War II pacifism. Defense spending doubled. Their constitution amended. Their military went from just self-defense forces to a real, modern fighting force. A new regional power was literally born from the ashes of this conflict. So what about the United States, the nation that actually won the war? Well, it was a textbook Pyrrhic victory, the kind that costs so much it feels like a defeat. The financial burden was staggering, hundreds of billions of dollars. But the political cost was even worse. Back home, people got sick of the endless, expensive occupation. And on the world stage, America had proven it could topple any regime it wanted, but it also proved it had no idea how to build a stable nation in its place. Which brings us right back where we started, to 2030. The war is a memory, but the peace is very much a work in progress. The old North Korea is gone forever, that's for sure. But this new, unified Korea is still struggling to be born, and its final destiny is anything but certain. When analysts look down the road, they basically see three possible paths. The best-case scenario, all this pain and cost were just the birth pangs of a new economic and democratic powerhouse. The most likely scenario, a nation that's unified on the map, but forever divided by culture and resentment. And the worst case, the whole thing was a catastrophic mistake, leading to a failed state on China's border. The future remains unwritten. And so we're left with the ghost of Lee Hae-won's father, and a question with no easy answer. Look, the world is undeniably safer without the Kim regime and its nuclear blackmail. But was it worth the cost? Was the chaotic, violent, and painfully expensive peace that followed a price worth paying for the freedom he and millions of others never got to see? That is the question this alternate future asks all of us.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are dissecting a document that is equal parts fascinating and just absolutely terrifying. We're looking at Operation Peninsula Shield, which is a detailed alternate history analysis asking a question that, must have kept Pentagon planners awake for 70 years. What if the United States actually invaded North Korea? This scenario, it takes us to a hypothetical August 2023 and projects the conflict and its messy, messy aftermath all the way out to 2030.
It is a chilling read. We're looking at a timeline where all that rhetoric of fire and fury actually became kinetic reality. And the central tension we have to unpack here, it isn't just about troop movements or airstrikes. It's whether this scenario demonstrates that a military solution was a necessary surgical operation, or if it proves that the cure of invasion was actually far, far worse than the disease of containment.
That is the core question exactly. And my stance is pretty clear. I believe this scenario, despite the incredibly heavy costs detailed within it, validates the capability of the free world to remove a tyranny and stop an imminent nuclear threat. It suggests that the long-term pains, the economic shock, the social friction, are just the unavoidable price of a necessary liberation. We cut out the cancer. It hurt, but the patient survived.
And I see it very differently. I think the text illustrates a catastrophic strategic failure that's just disguised as a tactical victory. Yes, the war was won on the battlefield in 25 days. But strategically, we're looking at loose nukes, a fractured peninsula, economic ruin, and a geopolitical realignment that basically handed China a massive win on a silver platter. It frames the invasion as a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. We burned down the village to save it.
Okay, so let's get into the details because the context here is everything. We aren't talking about the US just waking up one morning and deciding to regime change Pyongyang for fun. The text describes a very specific triggering event. In July 2023, North Korea didn't just rattle the sabers, they detonated a 150-kiloton nuclear device.
Which is massive.
Exactly. I mean, for context, that is 10 times the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But they didn't stop there. They then shot down a U.S. surveillance aircraft in international airspace, killing all 24 crew members. The U.S. president in this scenario wasn't just reacting to an insult. He was staring down what they saw as a credible EMP threat.
And we should probably clarify for listeners, EMP, you mean an electromagnetic pulse.
Right. We're talking about a high-altitude nuclear detonation that's designed not to flatten a city, but to fry the electrical grid across a continent. The scenario implies the U.S. intelligence community believed Kim was getting ready to turn the lights out from Seattle to San Diego. I mean, potentially sending the U.S. economy back to the Stone Age. So in this timeline, the administration decided the risk of inaction was total devastation.
I grant you the provocation was extreme, but then you look at the execution. You call it a surgical operation, but the text describes the opening hours as an absolute meat grinder.
A meat grinder for the North Korean military, yes. Operation Peninsula Shield neutralized 400 artillery pieces targeting Seoul in the first wave. The worst-case models, the ones we've all feared since the 90s, they predicted hundreds of thousands of civilians dead in Seoul within the first hour. In this scenario, the casualties were 15,000.
Hold on, you're citing 15,000 dead civilians as a success? I understand it's below the apocalyptic projections, but that is still a stadium full of people wiped out in days. And that's just the kinetic war. The real nightmare starts the moment the shooting stops. We have to talk about the nuclear accounting problem.
The hunt for the warheads.
This is the part that proves my point about strategic failure. The scenario explicitly states that while coalition forces secured 22 warheads, the fate of the remaining 8 to 18 devices remains unknown. Think about that. We traded a known threat, a state actor we could deter with our own arsenal, for maybe a dozen loose nukes floating around the black market.
Well, floating around is maybe a bit of an exaggeration. The text does note that by 2027, confidence grew that most were secured. But let's look at the alternative. The regime had 30 to 40 warheads and was accelerating production. If we hadn't invaded, how many would they have had by 2030? 100? 200? The coalition successfully conducted a decapitation strike on Kim Jong-un's bunker on day 16.
Let's just define that quickly. A decapitation strike is a targeted attack aimed at removing the leadership structure, specifically killing the head of state, to paralyze the command chain.
Correct. And it worked. The speed of the advance, faster than Vietnam, slower than Iraq, prevented the regime from launching a full-scale nuclear first strike. They cut the head off the snake before it could bite the world.
But the snake still had venom in its tail. You say it prevented a full-scale strike, but the text says they still managed to launch 3 medium-range ballistic missiles. One hit near Busan, that's a near miss on a major population center. And going back to the loose nukes, the text describes a Pakistani smuggling ring in 2025 attempting to sell fissile material from that North Korean stockpile. This is the nuclear shadow. By smashing the state, we scattered the materials. We turned a security problem into a counter-proliferation nightmare.
It was messy, I won't deny that, but keeping the regime in place allowed them to build those weapons in the first place. The scenario shows that eventually the materials were intercepted. The US demonstrated it would not allow a rogue state to hold the world hostage. The alternative was living under a permanent nuclear sword of Damocles, wondering when, not if, Kim would use them.
Well, in this timeline, the sword actually fell. It just broke into pieces that wounded everyone. But let's zoom out to the geopolitical fallout, because this is where I think the advocate case really falls apart. I'm talking about the Chinese buffer zone.
I view that as a masterclass in crisis management, actually.
A masterclass? On day 11, Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River and occupied the northern 15% of the country. They effectively annexed sovereign territory.
But context matters. The US and China avoided direct conflict. That was the nightmare scenario. World War III, nuclear powers clashing. Because of pre-war back-channel diplomacy, the US accepted a concession. China stays in the north to manage refugees and security, and in exchange, the rest of the peninsula is unified under democratic government. Giving up a sliver of rugged territory to avoid a war with a superpower, that is a successful strategic outcome.
Giving up a sliver implies it wasn't a massive strategic loss. I mean, think about the real politic here. China essentially created a gated community in the north. They invoked a humanitarian mandate to occupy the territory, which created a permanent buffer between U.S. forces in Seoul and the Chinese border. They secured their flank, they secured the mineral rights in that region, and they did it all without fighting a war.
But they also took on the burden of feeding millions of starving people in that zone.
Which they used to their advantage. The scenario says by 2030, China emerges militarily stronger. They used the crisis to justify a 35% defense spending increase. They avoided the war, yes, but they kept the U.S. away from their border, and they get to look like the responsible peacekeeper to the global South. Meanwhile, the U.S. spent the blood and treasure, $600 billion by 2030, and China reaped the geopolitical rewards.
It's a compromise, certainly, but you're ignoring the massive economic potential of the unified territory. Let's talk about the trillion-dollar question of reconstruction. You see a cost, I see an investment. The scenario highlights that by 2030, the North's GDP is growing at 8 to 12%. That is explosive growth.
It's recovery growth from a baseline of 0.
It's more than that. We are talking about rare earth minerals. The North sits on deposits worth an estimated $6 to $10 trillion. And for those listening, rare earths are the vitamins of modern industry. They're in your iPhone, your electric vehicle battery, your F-35 fighter jet. Right now, China dominates that market. This invasion broke that monopoly. That's not just a number. That's the future of the global tech supply chain secured for the free world.
Potentially secured, eventually, but you have to survive the transition. The reality described in the text is integration fatigue. By 2026, 38% of South Koreans believe reunification was a mistake. That is a heartbreaking statistic. The economic burden is crushing the South. The German reunification cost about 2 trillion euros over 30 years. This scenario suggests Korea spent $1.5 trillion in just 7 years. It nearly bankrupted Seoul.
Which is why the one country, two systems approach was brilliant. The Northern Administrative Region allowed for a pragmatic solution. You can't just merge two economies with such a disparity overnight. The text notes Northern workers had 5% the productivity of Southerners. You can't pay them the same wage immediately. It would cause hyperinflation and mass unemployment.
So they created a caste system. Let's just call it what it is. The Northern Administrative Region essentially legislated an underclass. The text describes discrimination where Northerners occupy lower economic tiers despite formal equality. So you have a factory floor where the guy on the left makes $30 an hour because he's from Seoul, and the guy on the right makes $2 because he's from Pyongyang. That's not a country, that's a powder keg.
It was a transitionary measure. Wage subsidies were ramping up.
And look at the political blowback, the rise of the Democratic Reconstruction Party. These are former low-level Workers' Party members advocating for collective economic structures. You've created a political entity within the unified state that fundamentally opposes Seoul's worldview. That is not a recipe for stability. It's a recipe for long-term internal conflict.
That brings us to the human element. You call it internal conflict. I call it the messy process of democracy. At least they can form a political party. We have to talk about the liberation aspect. Millions of people were freed from what the text calls history's most comprehensive totalitarian system.
Freed into what? A refugee camp?
Freed to live. Look at the refugee's journey mentioned in the text, Lee Hae-won. She lost family, yes, and the text doesn't shy away from that trauma. But she explicitly says she values her freedom to read, to travel, to think. She says, "I'm grateful." We cannot just gloss over the moral magnitude of ending the concentration camps. The text mentions a soldier's burden, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell. He questions the cost, sure, but he also acknowledges they freed the camps. There is a moral weight to that which balances the ledger.
Mitchell also says, "Ask me again in 2040. Why? Because he lost 3 friends to the insurgency. And we need to double click on that insurgency, because it wasn't just a few holdouts. From 2023 to 2027, the text describes a brutal guerrilla war.
Which was defeated. It didn't become a forever war like Iraq or Afghanistan.
Perhaps militarily it ended, but psychologically, The text cites a survey where 67% of older North Koreans still believe Kim Il-sung performed miracles. You can destroy the bunkers with bunker busters, but you can't bomb the indoctrination out of a population. Lee Hae-won calls her generation a generation of ghosts. That is the human cost, a population that is physically free but psychologically unmoored. The invasion destroyed the state, but it couldn't fix the minds of the people immediately.
I agree. Deprogramming a cult of 25 million people takes time. It's a generational project. But let's look at the global consequences, specifically the proliferation paradox you alluded to earlier.
This is my biggest concern, and it's where the scenario gets truly dark. The text conclusion on global fallout is damning. Iran accelerated its nuclear program. Saudi Arabia started looking at options. Why? Because the invasion taught the world a very clear lesson. Nuclear weapons are only a deterrent if you acquire them before the Americans invade.
That is one interpretation, but I'd argue the opposite. The U.S. demonstrated that it would act. The containment of North Korea was no longer an option after the 2023 tests and the downing of the aircraft. By taking action, the U.S. restored credibility to its red lines. If the U.S. had done nothing after a nuclear test and the murder of 24 airmen, what would that have signaled to Iran or China? It would have signaled weakness.
But look at the reaction. South Korean public support for its own nuclear weapons jumped to 52% by 2029. That is massive. We supposedly fought a war to denuclearize the peninsula, and 6 years later, half the population wants the bomb. The invasion didn't stop proliferation, it incentivized it. It proved that in this new world, you are either a nuclear power or you are a target.
I think the spike in South Korean support reflects the dangerous neighborhood they live in, specifically a rival China, not necessarily a failure of the invasion. And speaking of the neighborhood, look at Japan. The war accelerated Japanese rearmament, doubling their defense spending to 2% of GDP.
You say that like it's a good thing.
It is. It normalized Japan's role in global security. Japan became a key reconstruction partner, investing $45 billion. The text calls this a transformation of Northeast Asian relationships. That is a positive development, a stronger, more active Japan working alongside a unified Korea to counter Chinese influence. It's essentially the birth of a NATO for the Pacific.
This flips the entire post-World War II order on its head. For 70 years, the U.S. policy was to keep a lid on Japanese militarization to prevent regional tension. This scenario suggests that by invading Korea, the U.S. broke the seal. Now you have a rearmed Japan, a nuclear-hungry South Korea, and a China that has annexed territory. East Asia looks a lot less like a stable alliance network and a lot more like Europe in 1914.
Or it looks like a region finally taking responsibility for its own defense instead of relying solely on the U.S. umbrella.
I think the pessimistic scenario outlined at the end of the text, permanent division or confederation, seems the most likely outcome of all these shifting plates.
And I lean toward the optimistic scenario the text offers. By 2050, full integration is possible. The text says North and South could become archaic regional designations, like East and West Germany are today. We're in the messy middle right now in the 2030 of the scenario. But the trajectory, 8 to 12% growth, a unified demographic advantage over Japan, points toward a powerhouse nation reemerging.
That feels like wishful thinking. The realistic scenario predicts a permanent underclass in a unified state in name only. You have a country where the northern half is essentially a resource colony for the southern corporations.
But that's still better than a totalitarian state threatening the world with nuclear fire, isn't it? Even if the North is poorer for a generation, they aren't starving in silence while their leader builds ICBMs.
Is it better if the result is a more dangerous nuclear world where every mid-sized power is racing to get the bomb because they saw what happened to Kim? I'm not so sure. We traded one rogue state for a global arms race.
We're coming to the end of our time, so let's try to land this plane.
I'll close with this. This scenario proves that military might cannot solve political problems. The U.S. spent nearly $1 trillion and thousands of lives to create a fractured Korea, a stronger China, and a more dangerous, proliferating world. The text leaves us with the image of Park Min-joon's brother asking, was life better before? The fact that the question can even be asked, that anyone could look back at the Kim regime with nostalgia, is a condemnation of the intervention. We broke it, and we haven't bought it. We're just paying for it.
It was untenable. You cannot have a rogue regime downing American planes and testing nukes with impunity. The scenario shows that while the price was agonizingly high, the removal of a nuclear-armed tyrant was achieved. The ghosts of the war are a heavy burden, yes, but they are the burden of a free society rather than a slave state. The text suggests that the optimistic scenario is possible. We gave the Korean people a chance at a future, something the Kim regime never did.
A chance bought with fire.
A chance bought with necessary action. The text ends on a profound reflection that I think we can both agree on. The question isn't if the US could invade, we proved we could, but whether any power can successfully rebuild a society after destroying it.
And whether that 2023 demonstration test was worth the decade of chaos that followed.
That is for our listeners to decide. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Thank you.